My new CEO told me to pack my belongings and leave the building on her first day because she believed my executive vice president position represented operational redundancy that prevented her from establishing clear leadership authority. My name is Ryan Mercer, 49 years old, Executive Vice President of Operations with 21 years at Ridgeline Logistics Corporation in Nashville, Tennessee. I had spent more than 2 decades building the operational systems, client relationships, and strategic partnerships that transformed a regional trucking company into a $240 million logistics operation serving 17 states across the southeastern United States. When Jennifer Blackwell called me into her office at 8:47 a.m. on Monday morning, exactly 13 minutes after arriving for her first day as CEO, and announced, "Ryan Mercer, I need you to pack your things and complete departure today because this company needs a single clear leader, not redundant executive positions," I simply nodded and said, "Understood. I'll gather my personal items." What Jennifer didn't realize during her decisive first-day termination was that the manila envelope in my briefcase contained documents stamped by the Tennessee Secretary of State 51 hours earlier, officially registering my acquisition of 52% ownership of Ridgeline Logistics through a leveraged management buyout that made me majority owner and scheduled chairman of the board. The special board session she was required to attend at 11 a.m. that morning, less than 3 hours after firing me, would be announcing my new role to the company, and Jennifer's impulsive termination was about to become the shortest CEO tenure in Tennessee corporate history. The ownership transfer that Jennifer apparently never discovered during her 3 weeks of pre-start analysis had been finalized at 4:23 p.m. on the previous Wednesday, when the Tennessee Secretary of State's office processed the final registration documents for my acquisition of founder and outgoing CEO Thomas Brennan's majority stake. Thomas, who had built Ridgeline Logistics from a single truck operation in 1987 to the regional powerhouse it had become, had structured a succession plan allowing me to acquire his 52% ownership through a management buyout backed by private equity firm Clearwater Capital Partners, who were providing the leverage financing that made the $87 million transaction possible for someone with my executive compensation history. I appreciate the opportunity to have contributed to Ridgeline's growth. I responded to Jennifer's termination announcement while maintaining professional composure that gave no indication I was actually her boss and would be chairing the board meeting in 2 hours. "I'll complete my departure as requested." Jennifer seemed satisfied with my acceptance, apparently interpreting my lack of argument as confirmation that her assessment of my redundancy was accurate. "I know this is difficult, Ryan, but organizations need clear authority structures. Your operational role overlaps too significantly with CEO responsibilities, and maintaining both positions creates confusion about decision-making authority. I'm sure you understand this is just business efficiency, nothing personal." The explanation revealed that Jennifer had spent her 3-week pre-start period analyzing organizational charts and reporting structures without apparently reviewing the most basic corporate documents, like ownership registrations, board meeting agendas, or the succession planning announcements that Thomas had shared with senior management 4 months earlier when he first disclosed his retirement intentions and his plan to sell majority ownership to me as his chosen successor. The manila envelope in my briefcase remained unopened as I returned to my office, a deliberate choice to let events unfold naturally without providing Jennifer any advance warning about the education she was about to receive. The documents inside included the Tennessee Secretary of State's official stamp confirming ownership transfer, the share certificates representing my 52% stake, and the board resolution appointing me as chairman effective immediately upon registration completion. All of this information was public record, available to anyone who bothered to check corporate filings or read board meeting agendas carefully. My 21-year career at Ridgeline had been built on the foundation of systematic operational excellence that transformed Thomas Brennan's entrepreneurial vision into a professionally managed logistics operation capable of competing with national carriers. When I joined Ridgeline in 2003, the company operated 47 trucks, serving 3 states with $8 million in annual revenue. Thomas had built successful regional operation through personal relationships and hustle, but he recognized that further growth required operational infrastructure, process discipline, and strategic planning that exceeded his entrepreneurial skill set. Mercer brings exactly the operational rigor we need to scale beyond regional carrier status, Thomas had noted in my initial hiring announcement. His background in supply chain management and logistics optimization will professionalize our operations while maintaining the customer service excellence that built this company. The operational transformation I led over 2 decades had involved implementing transportation management systems, developing carrier partnerships across the Southeast, establishing quality control protocols, and building the client relationships that expanded our contract base from 23 regional shippers to 847 clients across 17 states. The revenue growth from $8 million to $240 million reflected not just market expansion, but systematic improvement in operational efficiency, service reliability, and strategic account management that made Ridgeline competitive with carriers 10 times our size. Ryan's operational leadership has been the foundation of every major growth initiative this company has achieved, Thomas had stated during our succession planning discussions that began 18 months earlier. He's built the systems, relationships, and institutional knowledge that make Ridgeline valuable. Selling to him ensures continuity while rewarding the person who actually created most of our current value. The management buyout structure Thomas proposed had required creative financing because my net worth, while substantial for a career executive, was nowhere near the $87 million valuation that Ridgeline commanded based on its revenue, profitability, and growth trajectory. Clearwater Capital Partners, a middle-market private equity firm specializing in logistics sector investments, had provided the leverage financing that made the transaction feasible. Their assessment concluded that my operational expertise and institutional knowledge were themselves valuable assets that justified backing the acquisition, even though I lacked traditional buyer capital. Mercer's knowledge of Ridgeline's operations, client relationships, and competitive positioning makes him a lower-risk buyer than external acquirers who would face learning curves and potential disruption, Clearwater's investment committee memo had concluded. Backing his acquisition preserves operational continuity while providing upside from the growth strategies he's already developed. The negotiation and documentation process for my ownership acquisition had consumed 12 months of intensive work with attorneys, accountants, and Clearwater's investment team. The transaction closed on Wednesday afternoon after final regulatory approvals, with my 52% ownership registered officially through the Tennessee Secretary of State's office at 4:23 p.m. Thomas retained 18% ownership that he would gradually liquidate over the next 3 years, while Clearwater held 30% with their standard 5-year investment horizon before seeking exit through sale or recapitalization. The board of directors scheduling a special Monday morning session to announce my ownership acquisition and chairmanship had been planned for months as part of the succession process. The board secretary had sent Jennifer the detailed meeting agenda on Friday afternoon, 3 days before her Monday start date, with item 1 clearly stating, announcement of ownership transfer to Ryan Mercer and appointment as chairman of the board. The agenda included background on the management buyout, explanation of Clearwater's investment, and discussion of how my dual role as chairman and EVP would structure during the transition period before I assumed formal CEO responsibilities. Jennifer Blackwell had been hired under emergency conditions 3 weeks earlier when Thomas experienced a serious cardiac event that required immediate hospitalization and accelerated his retirement timeline. The board, facing unexpected CEO departure and concerned about operational continuity, had moved quickly to hire an experienced logistics executive who could assume leadership with minimal transition. Jennifer's resume was impressive. 15 years in logistics management, 3 successful turnarounds of struggling carriers, and reputation as decisive leader who could make tough operational decisions quickly. Blackwell's track record suggests she can step into CEO role and make necessary decisions without extensive hand-holding, board member Patricia Morrison had noted during Jennifer's hiring discussions. Her background in operational restructuring should complement Mercer's systematic approach while providing fresh perspective on efficiency opportunities. What the board hadn't fully appreciated during their emergency hiring process was that Jennifer's operational restructuring expertise consisted primarily of aggressive cost-cutting and organizational consolidation rather than strategic growth planning. Her 3 successful turnarounds had involved identifying redundant positions, streamlining management layers, and reducing operational complexity to improve profitability at carriers that were struggling financially. Ridgeline, however, wasn't struggling. It was growing rapidly and needed strategic expansion expertise rather than defensive restructuring. Jennifer had spent her 3-week preparation period before her Monday start date analyzing Ridgeline's organizational structure, operational costs, and management hierarchy. Her assessment concluded that the company had excessive management layers and redundant executive positions that created confusion about authority and decision-making. Her analysis specifically identified my EVP operations role as the primary redundancy, noting that my responsibilities overlapped significantly with what she intended to handle directly as CEO. The EVP operations position duplicates CEO operational authority and creates ambiguity about strategic decision-making, Jennifer's pre-start assessment memo had concluded. Eliminating this redundancy and consolidating operational authority under the CEO will establish clear leadership structure and improve decision-making efficiency. Recommend termination of Ryan Mercer as first priority action to demonstrate decisive leadership and establish organizational clarity. Thus, what Jennifer's analysis had failed to include was any review of corporate ownership documents, recent SEC filings, board meeting materials, or the succession planning communications that Thomas had been sharing with senior management for months. Her due diligence consisted entirely of organizational charts, compensation reports, and operational structure analysis without apparently checking the most basic corporate governance information, like who actually owned the company she was about to join. The board meeting agenda that clearly explained my ownership acquisition had been sitting in Jennifer's email inbox since Friday afternoon, but she apparently either hadn't read it carefully or hadn't understood its implications when she decided over the weekend that her first decisive action would be terminating me. Her focus on making a strong first impression and establishing clear authority immediately had overridden whatever basic instinct might have suggested reviewing board meeting materials before making major personnel decisions. When I walked into Jennifer's office at 8:47 a.m. Monday morning, in response to her assistant's urgent summons, I had already been at the office since 6:15 a.m. reviewing operational reports and preparing for the 11 a.m. board session that would formalize my chairmanship. The manila envelope containing my ownership documents was in my briefcase, unopened but available, if Jennifer had asked any questions about corporate structure or governance before announcing my termination. She didn't ask those questions. "Ryan, thank you for coming in," Jennifer had begun with the formal tone of someone about to deliver difficult news. "I'll be direct because I respect your time and professionalism. I've spent the past 3 weeks analyzing Ridgeline's operational structure, and I've identified organizational redundancies that need immediate correction. Your position as Executive Vice President of Operations duplicates responsibilities that should flow directly to the CEO role. Maintaining this redundancy creates confusion about authority and decision-making ownership." I had listened without interrupting, recognizing that Jennifer was delivering a prepared speech she had clearly rehearsed. Her confidence suggested she believed this decision was straightforward organizational efficiency rather than catastrophic judgment failure that would end her career within hours. "Effective today, your employment with Ridgeline Logistics is terminated," Jennifer had continued. "I need you to complete your departure by end of business today. HR will provide separation terms and outplacement services. I know this is difficult, but organizations need clear authority structures to function effectively. I'm sure you understand this is just business efficiency, nothing personal about your contributions or capabilities." The termination announcement had been delivered with practiced efficiency, suggesting Jennifer had made similar decisions multiple times in her previous turnaround roles. What she apparently didn't recognize was that terminating struggling executives at financially distressed companies was fundamentally different from terminating the majority owner of a successful growth company, and that business efficiency required actually understanding who you were firing before making the decision I understand your perspective on organizational efficiency, I had responded while standing to leave. I'll gather my personal items as requested. Should I attend the 11 a.m. board meeting that's on my calendar, or is my departure effective immediately before that session? Jennifer had checked her calendar with slight confusion. What's the board meeting about? I have something scheduled, but thought it was just introductory session with board members. The question had confirmed that Jennifer hadn't read the meeting agenda that explicitly explained the session's purpose. The special session was scheduled to discuss ownership transition and organizational announcements, I had noted, without elaborating on details that would spoil her educational experience. The agenda was distributed Friday. I can attend or not, depending on your preference as the CEO. Jennifer had waved dismissively. If it's already scheduled, you might as well attend, so we can introduce the leadership transition to the board. But your employment termination is effective today regardless of the meeting agenda. I had thanked Jennifer for the clarification and returned to my office, where I spent the next 2 hours responding to routine emails and reviewing operational reports with the calm detachment of someone who knew the manila envelope in my briefcase would make the morning significantly more interesting than Jennifer anticipated. Several senior managers who had heard rumors about my early morning meeting with the new CEO stopped by my office, asking if everything was okay, and I assured them that the board meeting at 11 would clarify organizational structure and everyone should attend to hear the announcements directly. At 10:47 a.m. I walked to the executive boardroom carrying my briefcase with the unopened manila envelope and took my usual seat at the conference table. The 5 board members were already gathering: Patricia Morrison, the independent chair, David and Maria Rodriguez, the other independent directors, Thomas Brennan attending his final meeting before full retirement, and Robert Sutton from Clearwater Capital representing the private equity investment. All of them knew about my ownership acquisition, and all of them knew that Jennifer had just fired me that morning. Because news travels quickly in corporate environments, and several managers had already contacted board members with concerns about the new CEO terminating the EVP operations on her first day. Jennifer entered at 10:58 a.m. carrying her tablet and portfolio, taking the seat at the head of the table that had traditionally been the CEO's position. She seemed confident and composed, apparently expecting the straightforward introduction meeting that her cursory review of the agenda had suggested. Thomas caught my eye and gave the slightest smile, acknowledging the absurdity of the situation and anticipating Jennifer's imminent education. Patricia Morrison called the meeting to order at 11:03 a.m. and immediately addressed the primary agenda item. Thank you all for attending this special session. We have several important matters to address this morning, beginning with a formal announcement that's been in planning for many months. As most of you know, Thomas Brennan has been preparing his retirement and succession, and we've been working on ownership transition that will ensure Ridgeline's continued success under new leadership. Jennifer was taking notes on her tablet, apparently still not recognizing what was about to be announced, despite the agenda sitting in her email and the succession planning that had been discussed openly with senior management for months. I'm pleased to announce that the ownership transaction closed last Wednesday, Patricia continued. Ryan Mercer has acquired 52% of Ridgeline Logistics through a management buyout backed by Clearwater Capital Partners. The transaction was officially registered with the Tennessee Secretary of State on Wednesday afternoon, making Ryan our majority owner. Effective immediately, Ryan assumes the role of chairman of the board and will be discussing his expanded leadership responsibilities as we move forward with the strategic plan he and Thomas have been developing. The silence that followed Patricia's announcement was absolute. Jennifer's face transformed from professional attention to visible confusion, then to dawning comprehension, and finally to the kind of horrified recognition that comes from realizing you've just made a catastrophic, career-ending error. Her tablet stylus dropped onto the conference table with a sharp click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent boardroom. "I'm sorry, Patricia," Jennifer said quietly. "Could you repeat that? Ryan Mercer acquired majority ownership? When did this occur?" Patricia consulted her notes with the patience of someone explaining information that should have been completely obvious. "The transaction closed Wednesday afternoon, Jennifer. Official registration occurred at 4:23 p.m. through the Tennessee Secretary of State's office. This special session was scheduled specifically to announce Ryan's ownership acquisition and discuss his new role as chairman. All of this was detailed in the meeting agenda that was sent to you Friday afternoon. Jennifer opened her tablet and presumably located the agenda she hadn't read carefully. Her hands were visibly shaking as she scrolled through the document, and her face had gone pale as the full scope of her error became apparent. Ryan is the majority owner. As of Wednesday, 51 hours before my start date, Thomas Brennan spoke up with carefully controlled tone that couldn't quite hide his amusement. Yes, Jennifer, Ryan and I have been planning this succession for 18 months. He acquired my majority stake with Clearwater Capital's backing, and we structured the timing so he could assume ownership before your start date to ensure smooth transition. The board scheduled this Monday morning session months ago specifically to formalize Ryan's chairmanship and discuss how his ownership would work with your CEO responsibilities. Jennifer looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. Ryan, when I spoke with you this morning about organizational restructuring and your termination, you didn't mention that you owned the company. I maintained the same professional composure I had demonstrated during her 8:47 a.m. termination announcement. Jennifer, you didn't ask about ownership structure or board meeting agendas. You announced my termination based on your assessment of organizational redundancy, and I accepted your decision as the CEO. I assumed you had reviewed relevant corporate documents and board materials before making personnel decisions affecting senior executives, particularly before your first board meeting, where ownership transition was the primary agenda item. Patricia Morrison's expression had shifted from formal announcement mode to visible concern about what had apparently occurred that morning. Jennifer, what exactly do you mean by organizational restructuring and Ryan's termination? This meeting was scheduled specifically to announce his ownership and chairmanship. What happened this morning before this session? Jennifer required visible effort to maintain professional composure as she explained her catastrophic error. This morning at approximately 8:47 a.m., before I had carefully reviewed the board meeting agenda in detail, I terminated Ryan's employment based on my pre-start analysis that the Executive Vice President of Operations position represented organizational redundancy that would conflict with CEO authority. I believed I was making a necessary efficiency decision to establish clear leadership structure. I didn't realize the board meeting would be announcing his ownership acquisition, and Ryan didn't mention his ownership status when I informed him of the termination. The boardroom silence following Jennifer's explanation was broken by David's incredulous question. How you terminated Ryan, the majority owner, 3 hours before the board meeting that was scheduled to announce his ownership, without reviewing the meeting agenda that explicitly explained he had just acquired the company. Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. I reviewed organizational charts and operational analysis during my preparation period. I focused on structural efficiency rather than ownership documents or board materials. When I saw the board meeting on my calendar, I assumed it was standard CEO introduction rather than ownership announcement. I didn't read the agenda details carefully, and I made my termination decision based on operational analysis alone. Maria Rodriguez spoke up with the sharp tone of an attorney recognizing serious governance failure. Jennifer, basic executive due diligence requires reviewing corporate ownership records, board meeting agendas, and organizational announcements before making any personnel decisions, particularly decisions affecting senior executives. You terminated the company owner on your first day because you analyzed organizational charts without checking who actually owned the positions you were eliminating. Robert Sutton from Clearwater Capital had been silent until this point, but now he leaned forward with visible concern about protecting his firm's $87 million investment. Jennifer, did you review any corporate filings, SEC documents, or ownership records during your 3-week preparation period? The ownership transfer has been public record since Wednesday afternoon. How did you miss this information? Jennifer's answer revealed the fundamental scope of her due diligence failure. I focused on operational structure, compensation analysis, and efficiency opportunities during my preparation. I reviewed organizational charts, financial reports, and process documentation. I didn't review ownership filings or corporate registrations because I assumed ownership structure would remain stable during CEO transition. I made a significant error in judgment by not reviewing board materials before making personnel decisions. Patricia Morrison consulted silently with the other board members through exchanged glances, then addressed Jennifer directly. "Jennifer, the board needs to discuss this situation in executive session. Ryan, given your ownership position and the circumstances of this morning, please remain here and assume the chairman's seat while we address the governance issues that have emerged. Jennifer, we need you to step outside while the board discusses your employment status." I moved to the chairman's position at the head of the table, while Jennifer gathered her tablet and portfolio with trembling hands and exited the boardroom. Thomas Brennan also stepped out to allow the board's executive session to proceed with just the directors and Clearwater representative. The discussion lasted 19 minutes, and through the conference room's glass walls, I could see Jennifer pacing in the corridor outside, her face reflecting the growing recognition that her career at Ridgeline was over before it had truly begun. When the board called Jennifer back into the room, Patricia Morrison delivered the decision with professional efficiency but unmistakable finality. "Jennifer, the board has reached unanimous consensus that your employment contract must be terminated immediately for cause, effective as of this meeting. Your termination of Ryan Mercer this morning, without reviewing basic corporate ownership documents or board meeting agendas, represents catastrophic failure of executive due diligence that demonstrates judgment incompatible with CEO responsibilities." Jennifer sat motionless as Patricia continued. "Your employment contract includes provisions regarding termination for cause, which the board is invoking based on this morning's events. You'll be required to return your signing bonus of $75,000 and the relocation expenses of $23,000 that the company advanced. Your benefits terminate immediately, and your departure from the facility must be completed today. We recognize this is an extremely difficult situation, but your actions this morning revealed judgment failures that disqualify you from executive leadership, requiring careful strategic thinking and thorough preparation." Jennifer's voice was barely audible. "I understand I made a serious error that I deeply regret. I'll complete my departure today as requested." The board meeting continued after Jennifer's departure, with discussion shifting to the strategic expansion plan that Thomas and I had been developing and the leadership structure that would govern Ridgeline under my ownership. The plan involved entering 3 new southeastern markets, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Richmond, using the operational systems I had built and the $45 million in expansion capital that Clearwater had committed as part of their investment. The growth strategy would take Ridgeline from $240 million to projected $420 million in revenue over 36 months, while maintaining the operational excellence and service quality that differentiated us from national carriers. "Ryan, we apologize that your first day as chairman began with being fired by the CEO," Patricia Morrison said during the post-meeting executive session. The board should have ensured Jennifer was fully briefed on the ownership transition before her start date. We assumed she would review the board materials and corporate filings as part of her standard preparation, but we should have confirmed that explicitly. I appreciated the apology, but noted that Jennifer's failure revealed character issues that would have emerged eventually regardless of this specific incident. "Patricia, Jennifer's due diligence failure wasn't just about missing the ownership announcement. She spent 3 weeks analyzing organizational structure and decided to terminate a senior executive on her first day without reviewing that person's background, performance history, or role in the company's success. Even if I hadn't been the owner, terminating the EVP operations who built the systems that generate our revenue would have been catastrophic judgment. The ownership issue just made the error more immediately obvious." Thomas Brennan agreed with my assessment. Jennifer's background in turnaround situations trained her to make quick cuts and eliminate perceived redundancy without understanding what actually drives success. Ridgeline doesn't need turnaround, it needs strategic growth. Her instinct to consolidate authority by eliminating senior operations leadership revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what this company does and how it succeeds. The management team and key clients who had heard about my morning termination through the efficient corporate rumor mill were relieved when I sent company-wide communication that afternoon explaining the situation with appropriate discretion. This morning's leadership changes have been resolved. I'm remaining with Ridgeline as chairman and majority owner, and we'll be moving forward with the strategic expansion plan that we've been developing. Jennifer Blackwell's brief tenure as CEO has ended by mutual agreement, and I'll be assuming CEO responsibilities, in addition to my chairman role. Operations continue normally, and I look forward to discussing our growth strategy with each of you in the coming weeks. The response from managers and clients was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Several key accounts who had been concerned about new CEO potentially disrupting relationships sent messages expressing relief that I would be continuing in leadership. The operations team, which had been quietly panicking about losing the EVP who had built their systems and processes, breathed collective relief that organizational continuity was preserved. Jennifer Blackwell's 3-hour and 47-minute tenure as CEO of Ridgeline Logistics became industry legend within days as the story circulated through logistics sector executive networks. The narrative of CEO fired her boss on day one without checking ownership records was too compelling not to share, and Jennifer's reputation collapsed as the cautionary tale spread through the tight-knit community of logistics executives who all knew each other and shared stories about spectacular career failures. "Have you heard about Jennifer Blackwell?" became a common conversation opener at logistics conferences and industry events over the following months. She took a CEO job at Ridgeline Logistics, fired the EVP operations on her first morning, then discovered 3 hours later that she'd just terminated the majority owner right before the board meeting announcing his chairmanship. Her entire tenure lasted less than 4 hours before the board fired her for catastrophic lack of due diligence. The story's details varied slightly in different tellings, but the core narrative remained consistent. An aggressive turnaround specialist had brought her cost-cutting instincts to a successful growth company, identified the senior operations executive as redundant authority, and fired him decisively on day one without bothering to check who actually owned the company she had just joined. The punchline was always Jennifer's face when the board announced ownership transfer at the meeting scheduled 3 hours after her decisive termination. Jennifer's attempts to recover her executive career were unsuccessful. The logistics industry is relatively small, and stories about spectacular failures circulate widely among the executives and board members who make hiring decisions. When Jennifer's name appeared in candidate pools for subsequent CEO opportunities, the Ridgeline incident was inevitably mentioned, and boards concluded that someone who had terminated their boss without reviewing basic corporate documents demonstrated judgment failures too serious to risk at the executive level. "We seriously considered Blackwell for our restructuring initiative," one board member told me at an industry conference 9 months after the incident. Her turnaround experience looked impressive until we heard the Ridgeline story. When we asked about it, she admitted the error but claimed she was acting on incomplete information from the board. That response made it worse, trying to blame the board for her failure to read meeting agendas and check ownership records showed she hadn't learned anything from the experience. Standing in my office at Ridgeline 18 months after Jennifer's memorable first day, I reflected on how her impulsive termination had inadvertently validated everything Thomas Brennan had said about why I should be his successor. Building a successful logistics operation required systematic operational excellence, strategic patience, careful judgment about personnel and organizational decisions, and thorough preparation before making major moves. Jennifer's aggressive turnaround instincts and her confidence about making decisive first impressions had been completely unsuited for leading a company that needed strategic growth rather than defensive restructuring. The manila envelope that I had kept unopened during Jennifer's termination announcement remained in my desk drawer as a reminder that sometimes the best response to people who fire you without doing basic research is quietly waiting for the meetings that will educate them about their errors. Jennifer's assumption that she could terminate the EVP operations to consolidate CEO authority had revealed dangerous impulsivity that the board correctly identified as disqualifying for executive leadership, and her 3-hour tenure had become the logistics industry's definitive cautionary tale about the importance of due diligence over decisiveness. The strategic expansion into Atlanta, Charlotte, and Richmond that I had been planning with Thomas was proceeding successfully 18 months after taking ownership. The $45 million in Clearwater capital investment was funding new terminal facilities, expanded fleet capacity, and the operational infrastructure needed to serve those markets with the same excellence that had built Ridgeline's reputation in our original territory. Revenue was tracking toward $340 million for the current fiscal year, ahead of our $420 million 36-month target, and the operational systems I had spent 21 years building were proving scalable across the broader southeastern region. Ryan, the board couldn't be more pleased with how the ownership transition has worked out, Patricia Morrison noted during our 18-month review meeting. Despite the unusual circumstances of your first day as chairman, you've executed the growth strategy exactly as planned while maintaining operational excellence. The Jennifer incident has actually become a useful governance case study. We've shared the story with other boards as an example of why CEO candidates need thorough vetting and why due diligence matters more than impressive resumes. The professional satisfaction of leading Ridgeline as both chairman and CEO came not from Jennifer's failure, but from validation that the operational expertise, strategic relationships, and institutional knowledge I had built over 2 decades had been properly recognized through Thomas's succession planning. Jennifer's view of my position as redundant authority had revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what made Ridgeline successful, and her termination by the board had prevented her from dismantling the operational systems that generated competitive advantages and enabled growth. Did you ever consider warning Jennifer about the board meeting when she fired you that morning? Thomas asked during one of our quarterly dinners after his full retirement. So you could have mentioned your ownership and avoided the whole spectacle. I thought about the question carefully before responding. Thomas, the moment Jennifer said, "Pack your things," without asking about the board meeting agenda or checking ownership records or discussing with you about succession planning, I knew she had failed at basic executive preparation. At that point, warning her would have just postponed the inevitable discovery that she wasn't suited for the role. Better to let the board meeting reveal her judgment failure clearly, rather than giving her opportunity to recover from an error that reflected fundamental character issues. The manila envelope in my desk drawer represented a principle about professional interactions, that people who make major decisions without doing basic research deserve to experience the consequences of their shortcuts, and that sometimes the most professional response is allowing those consequences to unfold naturally rather than intervening to prevent them. Jennifer's termination of me wasn't just about missing ownership information. It was about her instinct to act decisively without understanding context, her confidence about eliminating redundancy without investigating what actually drove company success, and her assumption that making tough calls quickly was more important than making them correctly. The best revenge against people who fire you without checking basic facts is simply attending the meetings they should have prepared for, I noted during a presentation at a logistics leadership conference about governance and succession planning. Jennifer Blackwell's 3-hour CEO tenure taught an expensive lesson about why decisive action without proper preparation isn't leadership. It's just impulsive judgment that eventually encounters the facts that should have been reviewed first. The professional response is letting those facts speak for themselves rather than arguing about them prematurely. Have you ever been fired by someone who didn't realize they worked for you and discovered that the most professional response is simply waiting for the meetings that will correct their misunderstanding? Executive leadership requires recognizing that people who act decisively without being informed eventually encounter the realities they should have investigated first, and sometimes the best approach is letting those realities educate them naturally rather than trying to explain what they should have already known. If this story of ownership transitions, executive due diligence, and the importance of careful preparation over decisive action resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to Revenge Tales with Luke. Share your experiences with impulsive leadership decisions, corporate governance failures, and the consequences of acting confidently without being informed in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing similar situations with executives who prioritize appearing decisive over actually being prepared. See you in our next story.